Welcome Patrick back to give a lecture here at the A. Patrick's been a tutor here, of course, for 10 years, and reminds me that this evening it's the 10th anniversary of his last evening lecture given at this podium here at the AA, which I think was autumn 1997, as we began work on version 1.0 of a program called the DRL. Patrick delivered a talk as he began teaching here at the school that autumn. And I was trying to think of one of the hundreds of anecdotes with which maybe to introduce Patrick and welcome him back. I think for me, the story I've turned to just to introduce him this evening is a visit that we made together 4 or 5 years ago in Graz on the occasion of Zaha and Patrick's exhibition Latent Utopias that autumn, in which I tagged along with Patrick on a taxi ride from the school where we were working to the outskirts, I guess, somewhere of Graz, to an abandoned warehouse that contained within it a very strange surface that a crowd of people were standing around trying to figure out what it could possibly be. And Patrick jumped out of the taxi, and within about 3 minutes, to a crowd of performers, consultants, clients, fabricators, engineers, other architects, all of whom were trying to figure out what this thing was. And they'd clearly been commissioned, Zaha and Patrick had been commissioned, I think, to create a stage set of some kind for this group of people. Within a matter of minutes, Patrick reassured them, cajoled, convinced, and with a kind of enthusiasm that really is Patrick's great gift as a designer, thinker, and architect, convinced these people that the project first was a stage, would do everything that the designers had been commissioned to accomplish, and of course that it would in the end absolutely exceed every expectation that group of people had about what a stage could be in modern performance today. That's the kind of performance that Patrick over and over again in this room, in this school, in the office at Zaha's, down the road, with all of the clients and consultants that he works with now around the world, brings to bear every hour of his working life as an architect. I've witnessed it in many forms, and I think you all have too, when Patrick has delivered lectures in the form of a question to a group of students or other teachers. I think it's an incredibly rare quality. It's one of genuine enthusiasm, belief, and conviction in the possibility of how projects and work can change the world that we have today, that it can in fact transform everyday expectations, which I think is the ultimate guiding principle of the work of so many of us in places like this. And Patrick is going to share with us some of that enthusiasm in the form of a lecture that he's titled tonight, Parametric Urbanism, which examines the taking of tools of parametric design and applying them to the category of urbanism, as he says, in such a way that the parametric paradigm can be harnessed to build up urban fields with a new level of ordered complexity. It's a topic that Patrick knows intimately and is a genuine expert of today, and it's one born out of the work that he and Zaha does in the office right now around the world as architects that are operating literally at an unprecedented scale of operation, which extends well beyond that of individual buildings to include now entire fields of those buildings, parts of a city, cities, and entire portions of countries. It's a project that, as he says over and over again, demands that architects completely retool how it is they think and operate, and I think that's what he'll be sharing with us a bit in tonight's talk. Patrick, of course, has taught here for the last 10 years, since he and I set up the DRL in 1996-97. That lab, the DRL, is currently in the early stages of a 3-year design research agenda, also called Parametric Urbanism. The first round of projects of which were shown here a couple of weeks ago in the Phase 2 presentations. Patrick studied philosophy in Bonn, Stuttgart, and London, and in 1999 completed his PhD at the Institute for Cultural Science at Klagenfurt University. In Germany, his activities include, of course, an extensive amount of writing and teaching around the world. He works as a curator and, of course, has written extensively on the work of Zaha Hadid, of which he is an incredibly vital and enthusiastic partner in that enterprise. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Schumacher.
Many thanks for this generous introduction. I've structured the evening in two parts. Before I come to parametric urbanism, which is the topic where I introduce a series of interlocking ideas and researches, both by the office and students, I wanted to kind of show the news from the office, which is kind of continuously rolling out, and even for myself it's very tough to kind of catch hold of this stuff. But it's all condensed on this laptop, so I've decided to share that with you. And even if some of the people who have been working on this stuff are sitting here, I'm sure not all of them, or not any except myself, knows all this stuff, because it ended up on this laptop. And even Zaha will be surprised and find some news, perhaps. But I want to start with a retrospective, and a bit of old news, that we had the grand retrospective Zaha did at the Guggenheim last summer, and it's quite incredible to look at back, and that I feel that in terms of the topics and themes, and also the last 10 years of DRL, in a sense, are similarly locked in this single paradigm in a way. For a long time we've been working on this notion of complexity and making this coincide with notions of seamlessness. And this is what we've gone through these kind of larger projects in the last 2-3 years, which I will go through, and objects, and as I said, total fluidity on all scales, a new series of visuals, and a kind of element which perhaps portends the future, where we have new technology and electronics embedded, and the kind of space and coming very close to the body also in terms of products, etc. So what I wanted to do, I just go through just this reminder of the completed works out of 25 years of research. Of course, there are hundreds of projects unseen and partly published. That's perhaps another time where we have to kind of sift through this. But this is a kind of countdown of buildings, starting with the Vitra fire station completed in 92, and going through some of those. I don't even have to announce them. I suspect some of this is known. The kind of idea of integrating subsystems and components in an elegant and intelligent ways is what comes through here, and it's all the enormous amount of hard work, of course, to not only model the surface in Maya, but to bring that into construction with all the kind of subsystems and structures and details. That's what I think the achievement has been, looking at these build works, and it's amazing. I want to show. This is also included here in interior, the 30 rooms in the Hotel Puerto America. Where we also, again, really coming close to the body, and with this kind of sense of seamlessness and fluidity. We have currently, and that's the news, on site, quite a few projects as we speak, and we have, for instance, the Rome project, which is on site, I think, over a whole number of years, and I just show you kind of the progress of this, a very, very slow progress and a lot of technical expertise and learning curves for the contractors, and with our Rome office and Gianluca kind of looking after that and teaching and quality controlling that. But it's a pleasure to kind of see that emerging, and it's a kind of a reminder of the past coming to the fore, and I think it will stand up though still. We have also a number of years on site. Curiously, that circle is the bridge in Abu Dhabi, linking the peninsula. So this is the sketch design. I think it's also 5-6 years ago that we created that design, a kind of 6-8 lane highway bridge, and that's where it's located. You can see the pieces coming out. So both of these projects will take another 1 or 2 years to really come out, but it's comforting that these things are in the works. We have the bridge connecting to Zaragoza Expo coming up quickly, and the team is working. But here's a site. This one will later on removed. It's just a temporary kind of prop, and the first kind of piece of steel also starting to emerge. And this is the new project in Innsbruck, one of 4 stations plus a bridge. It's Thomas Fietzke driving this project, and we have the concrete structures and the steel roofs, and then the glass, double curved glass on top. I'm still debating if I should go to China tomorrow. This is the Guangzhou Opera House, which is on site. An exciting, our first and only project in China so far, which has kind of made it to the ground. It's a big opera auditorium with a multi-purpose next to it, and embedded in this kind of groundscape. And a very interesting steel mesh structure, continuously draped over this and then slicing into that these kind of ravines. Quite fascinated by the kind of knots which emerge from that geometry, and then the way we usually kind of follow these things up through modeling everything, and we have sample facade already with the facade contractor, and I think it's going to be very interesting. Just pure in terms of surfaces, stone and glass. And also on the interior, we're seeing the Chinese struggling to find their own techniques to translate these forms and casts. And we have on site our first tower in Marseille. Jim Havron and Stefan Wollerton looking after this. Also Simone from the DRS working on the facade. That's on site. And we have on site the Salerno ferry terminal with Paula Catherine and the Rome office looking after that. And that's the location. And it's just still exciting to see something dug out and makes it safe, even though we had already the case where the site was filled up after. On the drawing boards, we have another tower which is secured with Generali in the Fiera in Milan. This was the Dubai Dancing Towers. I have more later on this. It's an 80, 65, 65 and 55 story cluster of towers. More about this later. And this is Christos working on another Dubai tower in the vicinity. Tiago's working on a tower again for Barcelona University, including some office accommodation next to the Herzog Demeron on the Diagonal. And it's another ongoing for a long time, nearly in tendering process, the Durango Arisco train station and tower. And it's interesting the way this kind of slices into the ground and interfaces the vertical with the horizontal ground surface, and even digs down into the ground, interfacing with the train station, etc. So that's going on as a team plowing away, and these are the kind of quiet teams. It's just churning out these projects, and we have the privilege now also to contribute to this madness. This is the skyline of Moscow city, where we have this piece. This is Moscow Expo Center. We're doing kind of a hotel and apartment tower and the horizontal piece. We presented this to the chief architect. He loved it and said, we just have to extend this up here. So we're kind of hitting that profile. And that's a very large structure, and is playing with the kind of two spaces of horizontal and vertical interfacing, with conferencing linking the hotel and the expo center and the kind of space in between. It's kind of sky bridge lobby and a glimpse at an apartment. A lot of the tower discourse and have been written about the new concept of interfacing with the ground surface, very important of course, and the navigation through the tower. It's a number of topics and differentiating up the tower, but I thought also it could be interesting, these towers, and it hit me when I studied the Swiss Ray Tower. You could design a tower like a product, something very precise, crystalline. And then you go on and kind of look at this, the handful of subsystems which make up the tower, cores and facade, and you develop a idea for each of them. You differentiate the piece. It's an elegant slab. You pull it in, and to make it sure it's understood like equipment, there are certain symmetries in both directions operating, and games of dissolving the edge and establishing voids and developing this as a kind of piece which could sit in a number of places. And we've done that with study with Hanif Kara, also on the kind of structural facade. And it's I think it's an interesting piece of which we're proposing here for the State Oil Company Tower for Azerbaijan. And it's kind of sitting in that street space, so it will be very transparent, I hope, in that. And it is the idea of a kind of fully wrap around winter garden all the way up with scatter of vertical connections for the headquarter internal communication. So since this was unseen, I've made a few comments on this. This has been seen. This is currently in the works. And the civil library on the square, beautiful entrance lobby. We have also in the works and continuing with the Basel concert hall, with a big concert hall room onto the square and lifted up. And we have tendering currently already the Glasgow Transport Museum. We're tendering currently the Montpellier Library and Archive and office building for the regional government. It's all a concrete structure with Stefan Hoff working on it. We have tendering the Naples train station with Filippo from the Rome office and Paula, and we have these are kind of the set out geometries for all the roof beams, and it's fully developed three-dimensionally. We have currently working under Jim's leadership and originally designed by Safed the Olympic pool, the Aqua Center, and we have something perhaps not seen here with Lars working on and his team on the Arc Academy school in Brixton, and it's interesting. It's a kind of sports school, and we decided to let the racetrack kind of run through that project, and it's been very tough to with a small budget and tough planners to get something exciting going there. We have a small new project in Innsbruck in the works, a small office building, and we have won a competition in Aachen. So far not been on our kind of radar, the issues, but here we've been working with Transolar, and it's because it's an environmental engineering faculty building for the University of Aachen. So we have wind turbines and things like this integrated and embedding it in the landscape. The Heidi Aleph Center is a cultural center of Baku, Azerbaijan, that has been presented, and it's a composition of three components: a museum, a library, and a conferencing center linked with the fluid, integrating with the landscape piece there. The continuous surface will be marble clad. We designed a whole island in the Tykes and Kirkos, and we are showing, we've developed this kind of condo hotel there. We also have, I was in Budapest last week to present to the mayor this kind of piece, and I will show more about this later. This is a kind of top office building in the center of the city. And we have Christos working on currently, and that's a project competition win also, like the Budapest one, in Nicosia at the kind of borderline mount, a public bridge square with this kind of undercrops, quite interestingly, with urban furniture like becoming columns. And we have still this one in the works, a competition win for Graz kind of boarding house. We doing furniture. This is the latest series, launched with Established & Son and Philips de Puri, called Seamless. It's an interesting voluptuous cupboard, first freestanding cupboards in 5,000 years history of furniture, which stands free, and you can push the drawer from one side, it comes out on the other, and they can slide through like blocks. I think it's a fabulous piece with fluid and precise and beautiful, and we have Melody to thank, and she also came up with these strange names. Kind of chaise structure, another chaise which could agglomerate. These are very abstract pieces to create kind of a space, to charge space, make space, space-making furniture pieces, and serif, kind of calligraphy, shelving, and Necton, the kind of cluster, and swarming, which is a topic. These are being kind of launched and available. We just, I think it's 2 weeks ago, we opened the Ideal House show, a kind of attempt to show with total fluidity on many scales in the big Cologne Furniture Fair with some pieces of us. It's kind of second level with an integrated bed, and we just kind of migrated some of our stuff into it and kind of affiliates nearly by itself with all these kind of soft surfaces and curvilinearity. And we're still trying to do, and although we're nearly giving up on this house in San Diego with the client. But we have another client. This is on site. In fact, this is our Russian client with the villa in Moscow. Both of these villas are 2,500 square meters. So we're talking serious buildings. And the idea is to embed a whole series of rooms into the kind of sloping ground, and then pull out the bedrooms on top because it's kind of dense forest. It's a real heroic kind of James Bond style, and you can kind of go up there. And we use this. This is like a research project also in terms of new materials and structure, and just it's quite amazing to dream, kind of dream house. Him and her up there over the rooftops and trying to figure out how to build it there. And with this a competition win in Calgary, Sardinia, just came up recently against Herzog, Nouvel and others, very ambitious museum of contemporary art and primitive art. Yes, I don't know this one. And this is just an unbelievable form and a series of interesting spaces. It's all about the porosity of this, in the inside-outside relationships, and some of the installations have been proposed into that as well. And Dubai Opera is one of our favorites. It's in the lagoons, a whole kind of island, opera theater, museum, hotel, music school, etc., etc. And this kind of dunescape wall will be granite clad, and there's a massive model sitting somewhere in a Dubai showroom at the lagoons. And again, we're moving in, and this is Dylan was in charge with this, our ex-DRL virtuoso modelers kind of onslaughting on this on all levels. The hotel extension, we recently added to that, kind of with double and triple suite balconies. And I am one more thing to show, which we launched last week in Abu Dhabi. There's a kind of cultural district, masterminded by Tom Krentz in the Guggenheim. There will be a new Guggenheim Museum and a string of new museums, including Nouvel's Louvre Museum and Andor's thing. And this is our piece. It's a performing arts center projecting out into the water. And again, it's not going to be explained too much. It's a kind of idea of clustering the volumes there, because there are 5 theaters, and it's Niels and his teams and XDRL virtuoso Daniel kind of modeling a lot of that, capturing these volumes and streaming with public space in between, a massive kind of open air public space, and everything projecting to the water, and with the top concert hall on top overlooking the water and passages through. It's like Tom Grant's always kind of pushing us to the limit, and these kind of territories invite to kind of, really push that vocabulary. And this is kind of central space, and then all the auditoria, the opera, the music hall, the theater, and that fabulous concert hall all modeled through. And I was kind of talking about, there was this kind of monster heroic model, which is a glimpse, which I'm going to show you here, which everybody was gathering around, kind of 4.50 m inside out STL in parts, and it was an unbelievable kind of feast and trophy kind of object. It's just adorable. Parametric urbanism. When I was thinking about this, I was saying, in a way, we're doing this at DRL now, and it's in a sense where we started in DRL actually 10 years ago, with some of those large urban projects and the kind of extensive fluidity, more kind of less, still digital, but less kind of sophisticated with the processes we're involving now, and maybe less precise. We're already happy to kind of pull and stretch surface. Actually, I'm looking just at Kenny at this kind of fantastic gypsum kind of smear model, which is really something which we looked at, I guess, 2 weeks ago here in a much more refined way, similar. But also, I think it reminds me of Zaha's starting, because I think a lot of these ideas, initially just these drawings where you see urban fabrics, modulating and interfacing with different site conditions, particularly in Hong Kong, where you have the water and you kind of build kind of tall, and you kind of, the way the kind of fabric runs up the mountain and transforms and modulates and interfaces with these force fields, natural force fields. That is perhaps already the kind of paradigm, but just observed, not conceived as a project yet. And perhaps in the London rooftops it becomes this kind of scattered drift and something which is beyond composition. It has been later on discussed from parts to particle, instead of a handful of genuine objects, you kind of you deal with hundreds of fragments. It can only be grappled with perhaps by kind of fields and force fields which tackle this. And you have these kind of drawings still just locating a kind of project at Grand Buildings. This is still the 80s. These kind of menacing fields and the fluidity of the Thames as a kind of structure, charging and manipulating the urban fabric around it. And if you observe that, it is happening. It isn't actually made up. And also what we realized, projective geometry, fisheye perspectives, and isometrics, and could really kind of grab and unify a whole series of fragments, with focal points, and this become later also a project. And these were all just descriptive, and this is the first, perhaps, urban design proposal on a very high level of abstraction. We just looked at Madrid and the way the initial medieval kind of town was a kind of closed shell. It broke in the 19th century with this kind of octagon expansion. Then 20th century was a kind of linear axis coming out, just rolling out. And then it started late 20th, early 21st century to kind of pull out to the airport, and we just fantasized about these kind of satellite cities and the kind of eroding train tracks, rehabilitation, so on, large structures like docklands and so on. We became a totally new way of thinking and holding, managing a kind of an urban territory on a very, very large scale, with a very kind of rough brush stroke. And I think that's what we have to do. We cannot be scared of the large scale and of the boldness. And I think I want to use this slide for a moment to say that there's a new type of project which has emerged in our office, and that are these super large sites which are empty, and you cannot just, and in the discourse of adaptation, of drawing everything out of the context and kind of massaging an object intricately into it, that we love to do that, and we have a lot of those projects, was no longer possible. You really had to come up with a synthetic system, with something which has its own internal logic and proliferating force, and then, of course, it needs adaptive quality. It needs adaptive capacity to. And what do? We look at patterns, and a lot of these patterns just share what the urban pattern has. It sets up parcels, and it allows continuous circulation between parcels. And this is, for instance, the cracking patterns you find in all sorts of surfaces. So you have beehives again. You have lines and parcels, or you have the blood vessels and all sorts of patterns you can analyze mathematically with parameters. You can look at the patterns. You have river deltas, and it's interesting, the kind of branching patterns, but they flow back together, so it becomes a kind of lattice and has different scales operating. And these are all kind of, let's say, at parametric urbanism, we often just go scan all these kind of potentially interesting source domains for analogical transference. But I think one thing was very powerful, of course, looking back, was Frei Otto's work has been not only in terms of the lightweight structures, but this particular research was dedicated to settlement patterns and path logics, and it's just great to have this material computing predated here and have kind of self-organizing material processes, natural processes harnessed to compute and generate form. And that was an inspiration, and it still is a kind of reference point for the DRL and for our work. And at the time I looked at that when I first came here, and I said, okay, we have these points, and instead of just taking them around the ring, maybe you have any series of points in the field, and this is the same condition, everyone to everyone else, like this. And what can you do with it? And of course, on the one hand, this is discussed in terms of certain efficiencies, like total path length versus detour factor imposed. So here you have the direct from each to each. There's detour factor 0. Here you have a certain detour factor imposed. But the math of path length has been radically reduced. These parameters might also be here, but I was more interested in the logic, let's say, in the typology of these different patterns. Each of these takes the same number of points and connects all of them, but through a kind of different network logic. And of course it makes quite a difference whether you have a star which highly charges the field and privileges a position everybody is kind of looking towards, and there's no lateral connection, etc. Makes enormous difference for the social, the community or the social processes taking place in here, rather than the kind of isotropic grid or a random grid, or these kind of loop you could have with an empty center, or a spine, of course, very often you have. So there's all this kind of hierarchy of branching. So there's a number of systems I was interested in, and these types I would like to refer back to often, and also look at ways of superimposing them. And it was a topic in one of the DL projects this January. Or just a continuous line could capture these. And each of them has certain sets of adjacencies, logics which become social logics, and that's what we're interested in as well. And this is a grid we used for Singapore it's a soft grid, but it also kind of articulates through the densification a spine with secondary branches. It indicates perhaps even a kind of star or center. So there's the parameters you can set up will lead perhaps to transformations from quantity to quality as well. And we use this kind of soft grid, and of course we can affiliate. You should pick up all these random scatter and the empty void in between, which was a military camp, and you can kind of affiliate, and you let everything flow through smoothly. Everything is mediated, different directions are mediated. You can integrate your own kind of additional feature, this kind of green park, and this was this very interesting discovery to set up this quite traditional block grid, but allow this kind of distortions to differentiate, so from everything from very flat and large to small and tall, and different production machine. And we then kind of took that on, and we won a competition, even though it seemed so kind of drastic. We were quite committed that the geometry also on the skyline was very important for navigation, for announcing a curve in the swoop of the skyline, or to also articulate points of centrality with height, but also simply to unify the field. And that would allow that multiple architects could come in, and it would still have a sense of coherency and order, legibility, navigability. We worked with Larry Bass on this, arguing for this, and it won the day. And we looked at the first kind of cluster of 12 blocks, which we set up according to this logic. We put all the cores in, all the secondary routes through, and placed all the entrances on pedestrian routes. So we had a high level of envelope and entrance planning, and this is the results. We have these kind of topography running through the top topography, and all these curves would continue through that urban field, and it's very urban. And initially this was just a kind of science park topology with big lumps surrounded by car parks and fences. So there's no communication at all. And these are highly communicative urban spaces. And we have also introduced this kind of second layer of bridging for this kind of cluster of 12 blocks. So that was a first kind of leap into the extraordinary, and I think it becomes a reference point, and we won other master plans because we could point to that. This is, again, back to the kind of these patterns and how to set them up and what tools, and we just had it in DRL, but this one was a diploma project in Vienna. Somebody was interested in these kind of electric charge fields and electric field lines, and set up this idea of the radial city. I mean, it was precedent studies, and we moved from radial single center to polycentric, and with these kind of vector fields and field lines, he was able to then kind of negotiate multi-center setups, and it was beautifully resolved. And there was a number of iterations. He he set up his own scripts and algorithms to do that. There's a whole series of it's actually a live model. I can't show it right now, but a series of dials where you can type in the different charge values and shift them around, and it kind of computes very quickly the different results. You can test them, and you can place them into contexts, and it's beautiful, kind of a multi-centered radial city. Then kind of simulated some existing cities like the Vienna with the Danube and the center of the medieval town, and kind of regenerating, sufficient, let's say, overlap and affiliations with what you find to make this nearly a plausible hypothesis of an underlying similar logic. Place blocks onto that, make a project somehow. And this brings us to this whole idea of fields and navigating, where the fragments become smaller. It's just a glimpse back at the Strasbourg project. We did with Manuela was working on this for a long time, the Bilbao master plan, that whole island. And the initial master plan, for instance, was proposing a highway dropping a series of identical towers along, and it was kind of a political flop. And what this kind of small grain kind of drift of fragments was allowing to do was to allow to integrate a lot of the existing into kind of new kind of coherent field. And we're playing with kind of continuities, playing with topography, but also with kind of scrambling the skyline to have kind of layering in that long direction, and that came out quite well. Again, it seemed kind of quite large scale, but we didn't have to be that bold. They just gave us this whole strip as well right after that, and the other side as well, which was great because you got more and more of this stuff, but this time it could kind of integrate and modulate itself and adapt itself to the topography. It became even much more interesting, and then additional kind of logics with kind of cantilevering topologies added to that, let's say, pointing to the river. So I think it could be quite beautiful. And again, it works with relatively traditional underlying topologies, but totally transformed, I think, through these geometric logics and field logics. And we had a professor in Innsbruck, and have been kind of doing parametric urbanism there as well, to a certain extent, with some of these again Moray patterns, and I used the Fiera site where you can see certain adaptations, the way this is kind of pulled into these. The Moray comes out with perhaps something which is kind of tweaked and shifted to register certain affiliations pulling in, and then you just translate that perhaps into a kind of fabric, or there's this attempt to, and these are all kind of some kind of kinetic system where you can freeze frame. You can kind of look at this water surface and the way the kind of great lines kind of make a kind of pattern, and this can be kind of reinstalled. And at each state, the beginning state, there's more order, and the initial kind of emanating points register, and then becomes kind of continuous scramble nearly. This is then set into the site in this case, and again creating a kind of three-dimensional, just some ways of mechanisms to handle a large distribution of mass, and find grains and logics of clumping, clustering, and of passages through that, voids and solid distributions. And there's some iterations and processes in between, and then there's a kind of initial translation into kind of a mass of towers. Let's go on. There's these kind of issues of swarming, and we had this project in Beijing a while back. Again, there was it's a kind of new suburban kind of cluster with a large field of residential, retail, hotel, and we had this kind of segment of residential, and we created this kind of crossing lines, and then a kind of secondary branchings, and this idea to create a kind of flock of not only towers, because what in this case we did was, so you see this kind of a branching system for the circulation. In terms of the topologies, we used all the three primary urban topologies there are, which is the point tower, the slab, but turned as a bent slab, boomerang slab, to affiliate and to get a direction and affiliate with the towers, and the kind of a perimeter block. All of them are there, but they're made kind of similar and enter this kind of swarm condition, all directionality, all pointing to that crossing point, and then kind of being pulled by that tail. And then also there's an overall height agglomeration or envelope, which give that swarm a kind of overall shape, an overall order and entity, and different ways of studying those the way these roofs would be cut, and the way again you would have this branching logic and navigation space, a lot of retail between here with these tails, and they're using also to a certain extent the third dimension to manage these flows. And then the attempt to develop these subsystems in terms of facades, and certain idea of navigation core, always the connection to the outside, and perhaps kind of voiding out. Even these are so relatively small towers, there's a sense of interlocking the subsystems, somehow inter-articulating the subsystems with facade, core, navigation, and then also not being afraid to to unify that, the horizontal version of that, and to say all this will be kind of done in maybe continuous kind of granite surface, maybe on the ground as well as in the elevations. And then the sense of embedding these larger tower structures into the ground, like what is here quite successful, I think, in the Durango project, the way it kind of pulls along and structures the park. And it actually, there's a car park below, and these are entrances to the car park. There's a train coming in which hits here. There's a kind of mall wrapping around, and the Oisco train headquarter building kind of cutting into the ground. Also, this idea of embedding structures, again, looking at nature analogies, the kind of Guangzhou or the Dubai, again, the kind of rippling of the forms and allowing these forms to kind of interface and emanate from a continuous ground modulation, let's say. And this kind of sense of urbanism of taking the object and ground together to create a unified ensemble and force in the city is what we tried here with the Taichung. In fact, this is a scatter of American-style towers and sheds and small buildings. It's a total kind of cacophony, and we try to kind of give this kind of stringent order and pull together. These were Guggenheim Museum, Opera House, City Town Hall, and City Hall Assembly and Town Hall Administration to create this. And then we had interpreted this kind of ground forms in the Guggenheim Museum, and crystallizing and giving it an urban edge at this side, in this kind of bleeding of build forms and interarticulating with the landscape, but also in terms of the different subsystems and details. There is a sense of seamlessness with the layered and complex artifact, and that's something which we've called elegance recently. I think the AD is out. Elegance is something which emerges on top of complexity and coping and articulating complexity in this manner would perhaps give a sense of elegance, and it's something which is very hard to achieve. The way you kind of work openings into surfaces, the way you interarticulate maybe passage elements with structural elements, etc. And these kind of large urban objects, we developed this one here as well, which is the Taichung Opera House. And again, this huge kind of tongue pulling out and structuring that park and leading into a multi-level public event space. I think a very interesting project, also interfacing with the underground and then swinging up on the top and again moving back into the large urban room. A very interesting project. Architecture doing urban work and structuring urban spaces. So it's not only towers, but this is a topic here of embedding figures and moments of crystallization in a kind of field condition or urban extensive field. And again, going into the architecture and not being afraid of kind of grand gestures and coping with a larger territory. And again, student work in a similar vein, let's say that's one of the projects from the Vienna studio, and attempt to kind of work in this fashion with crystallizing objects out of a field. And again, you have always, the towers is always kind of complemented by large podium structures, and usually cut off from the ground and from that interarticulation through the podium. So there's a lot of a discourse is about non-podium solutions of these large tower structures being kind of integrated into an urban system. And this is, I think, a solution we're very proud of and interested in. This was for the Olympic Village in New York. It's kind of towers, kind of tightening them up, only let the core come through, you need a lobby, and then kind of dip them into the ground and create these kind of craterscapes around it, which ease the circulation between and all the podiums, in a sense, negative spaces. We, in effect, have, I don't have that image here, but we have used that idea since the Olympics didn't go to New York. And we've won a huge master plan in Valencia with 30 towers done, half of the towers done in this principle. So we're going to utilize that idea. These towers dip in and create this kind of space around them, and then allow the additional surfaces and facilities to be to be kind of accessible, and you kind of stroll through. And I think also this project, I'm stopping to show a few minutes. It's of course in a different setting, but the idea of having that urban blob kind of scooping, hugging this concave form and scooping the ground and making a continuity with the ground surface and entrance plaza is very important. I think very successful here is this kind of, and also the topic of, in terms of parametric urbanism, just only have the mass elements, but to analyze now the mass into its key subsystems, and they're quite simple, the kind of floor divisions or dissecting the space in terms of accommodation, then structure, navigation, circulation, and facade, and making a kind of, using that here as an example, but how to iterate it, we see that later, as a kind of generative component, which could then kind of shift and readjust these relationships, but always have tight relationships between these subsystems. Working a lot with the brise-soleil elements, because we wanted a full glazing, and the south orientation, the clear glass then kind of migrates to become strongly fritted and becomes this kind of photovoltaic absorbent glass here, and here it kind of translates into skylights through kind of underground and interarticulates with that dish kind of surface. And there's a lot of work in geometric coordination in terms of and I have to thank Ibru for that and her team on the getting this kind of mesh, wrapping that blob in a kind of coherent and resolved fashion, and then kind of densifying at the top and thinning out. So these hang that floor to create a kind of large kind of retail area here. And this idea of the kind of swarm brise-soleil is an interesting one, interfacing with it, and just formal affiliations, like we did in Strasbourg, where the kind of demarcations in the car park become the light slits, become the lampposts, become columns. That is something is legitimate, these kind of, for the sake of tying together and interarticulating. So very graphic and strong formal moves, creating these kind of, let's say, organic wholes. Again, it's kind of, these are differentially deep, and then they get a second circle inscribed within the circle. This interarticulates with the fritting behind, etc. And then extruding urban furniture, etc. Again, the kind of sense of interarticulating with the ground surface and expressing circulation and looking underground, ground, overground, and in terms of tower typology, or the differentiation of the tower upwards and the scattering through public spaces. These are the topics. When we started to get involved with towers, we tried to formulate a kind of thesis which has some of these key points, which is differentiating a tower as you go up the vertical axis. That implies navigation, because there's differentiation, you need to navigate that, and then the interarticulation of the subsystems. This was our sketch bundle tower for the New York World Trade Center, which is also very strong on, let's say, this kind of bundling could then be utilized to articulate the interfacing with all this kind of transportation not at the ground. So it's interfacing with the ground systems, let's say, which becomes a point, and the continuity of navigation from horizontal to vertical. And of course, bundle towers have been done a lot, and there's a number of others. But I think the particularity of ground interfacing, and we also set this in the Vienna studio with this kind of one of the very nice projects with Judith at the time, projecting kind of tower with unfolding it with the kind of the hinterland and leaving that an empty space and pulling it out to the waterfront. Or we did this kind of museum as a tower. And again, it's about let's say structuring the path up with an interception, with a navigation space, and interarticulating with the ground condition there. This was for Guggenheim Museum, worked on by Thiago and others, and articulating an entrance and a large horizontal room, etc. And the dancing towers. It's amazing, like these projects, like the Dubai Opera, also these colossal projects with all these fantastic space. And this one is an unbelievable cluster. And it was, both of these were competitions. The first time in Dubai they brought in, let's say, international avant-garde or European avant-garde into that country. And they all got their projects now. I mean, we won both these competitions last year. And the cluster makes sense in the sense that we have the joining at the bottom with office and hotel, and then the hotel swings over to rejoin with the residential, with a kind of sky lobby and so on. And here's conferencing across. And then we had the interesting also in this fact that it looks different from all sides. So it's always recognizable. It's always this kind of icon, that signature tower as they wanted it, but it changes, and you can orient where you are depending on how the tower looks, and they kind of keep shifting allegiance. And there's bundle towers, which have been done also at Vienna Studio. And then what happened was that that project expanded, and it's quite interesting because originally there was just the towers and some retail podium, and we got involved, and we've been asked to place the Dubai stock market on that site. And then there was also added the idea of a cultural center, and we came up with the idea of a bridge and a pedestrian bridge, and so it became this kind of unbelievable tangle. This is 600,000 square meter, and this extends 80 stories, and we have the equivalent thing stretched out, and Deva was working on this, and this is a kind of has its own total logic because it was a stock market. It's a kind of wraparound of small boxes of stockbrokers, which is kind of pleated in surface like the brain, surface expansion. That's the logic. And then the kind of feature of skylights to make these spaces work. And then this kind of feature migrated to the rest of the project to tie it in. So what is interesting, striking for me here, you can take anything with everything else somehow and kind of force this initial stage might be a collage, and then kind of massage and knit and cross-affiliate and end up with organically interarticulated wholes, which with a sense of cohesion and unity, not based on symmetry, not based on completeness of proportion, but based on these kind of transitions between elements, how the seams are articulated, how you modulate and move from one part to another, and then you kind of inhabit these kind of were the skylights of the DFM became the kind of expansive gardens and pool areas for the hotel, etc. And I realize it's always possible. It's like nature works. It always takes the stuff it has and goes through mutation, selection, reproduction, etc. And you can kind of make things work. These assemblages, you find new functions and adapt things to new purposes, and it will, in the end, at the end of the process, it will be kind of unified. Complex, which you can then also, I think, orient and navigate. We've always said complexity at that level needs cornerless flows and articulations, for instance, and it needs this kind of sense of continuity to bind things together, to let the eye travel and let the flows move. This is underneath public space of a DFM. We have this kind of a cultural center interarticulating with the retail swinging around. Just looking at Federico worked on this and the kind of crazy interior as a first attempt. So then the bridge is swinging out, and there's an interesting sense of dialectic of the random and then reordering. So because shifting out. And then it's something, you shift out one thing, once you adapt two or three things to that, it ends up being kind of logical and makes sense. So, I think you can always kind of get things to work if you kind of plow away on it. And with the new tools of subdiv modeling, etc., it becomes relatively, if you have the skills in some of the interiors of that bridge, it's important to have this. I mean, it's a simple idea of this kind of horizontal fold over, but this becomes something else. It becomes a kind of pier, becomes a landscape, becomes a quasi podium, which isn't one, and it kicks in at the back. And then these streams and ravines are navigation space in that residential tower. And it's a Moscow tower. It's a great topology because the cores are voided out, become kind of spectacular points of access and ascent. And this was our first sketch for the Fiera, where we had this kind of idea and bringing in the blocks, affiliating to the blocks, pulling them in and create that kind of cluster of towers. That was our master plan. It wasn't pursued, and in the end we had the kind of mishmash master plan. But still there's the idea of extending urban fabrics in and translating them and ending up with a cluster of towers. And this one is the mall coming in. I mean, twisting towers, there are too many now. We did this a while ago, but what it makes sense of is in terms of interarticulating that schism with the mall gap, and it becomes a navigation space. And when you step out of the elevator, at each level you would have that view across the tower. That's the idea of that. So there's always a kind of slice through the Barcelona Tower in this discourse, because it interfaces the horizontal part with the kind of vertical part. It swings out in different directions and tries to open the corners. I mean, structurally we have to work on this. I think it is, and it has been worked on, and some of these cantilevers are verified. So these are the later set of renderings. And with trusses, when it's important to have, I think this is quite interesting, the way this with reacts and addresses the urban corners in different ways, and how you kind of slip under and into kind of a courtyard condition, and then is revisited in terms of the internal navigation. And this is a tower, again, another way of taking this typology and flaring it down to the ground. So it's a multi-purpose. You start with residential, office, and retail as you expand the space, and you also then it really fuses and drives underground with large retail underground. But it's also the only tower or place, actually, it's originally designed for Beijing, where you can actually have in a single entity a degree of indeterminacy with respect to what these spaces are. The very emphasis then put on this big navigation void through, but which tighten in at the top, and where you have kind of a falling off of the public functions and more private. And we used that topic of the flaring and skirting way of bringing the tower down at this project in Marseille, instead of again having a podium. There is still a kind of annex building at the back of it. And a certain double skin and an attempt to align meeting rooms at this kind of schism and to integrate the drop-off canopy, etc. And there is lots of these attempts to see how these kind of buildings kind of interact with each other and with the ground. This is an attempt for Milan Hotel, the kind of webbing. And this one, we won a competition in Kazakhstan. It's based on the Voronoi pattern, and again, it's a cluster of towers, and it was, these patterns throw up these volumes and then pull out a series of towers, and then have this kind of web-like interface, pulling it together and articulating also the different functions: office, total kind of skinned, hotel, residential, but then to articulate also where is the kind of retail area and where is the kind of special event in the office building, etc. And so these kind of moves and then become programmed. We did the competition for ThyssenKrupp headquarter, a kind of dynamic diagram similar, a kind of force field and concentration of these boomerang type buildings, also working with a section, and then working a lot with the patterning to tie them together. This was supposed to be a kind of steel mesh type of facade. So the idea is, in the sense of which was beautifully kind of explored here. Usually, if you had asked to design a series of, let's say, tram stops or train stations, there has been this idea of kind of dropping the same element along the line, and here there's a kind of, let's say, genotype which has been developed for very, very different conditions. And this is also something which I want to, the principle is the same for what I would like to do in parametric urbanism, in terms of the building fragment, the tower, migrating across different conditions and having a series of subsystems, the kind of concrete undercrop, and then this kind of the roof playing with that. It's an underground station, a lifted up station, then the kind of strong slope station and the rival station. And this is the way they follow a certain morphology, certain logic and language. They never have columns, so the roof always kind of pulls down a side or a leg in the appropriate condition, and rests, and something comes up from the understructures. There's a kind of interplay of the platform structures and the roof structures. And again, I showed some of these are on site at the moment. And this is something we presented in fact last week in Bahrain. It's again a kind of master plan along the Formula One track, and it's an attempt to bring in the dynamic and draw in these force lines to then kind of agglomerate the building fragments relative to that, to create the kind of structure and logic, and then kind of have secondary flows and series of showrooms on that plateau with retail, hotel, etc. And then again this attempt to make kind of genotype which then kind of iterates and changes from a showroom to a museum, and the different car showrooms have been developed in this kind of topography. And it's learning also, trying to learn from car morphologies, as all the different brands are located here and embedded in that. This was work by Deva and his team, with Jehun and Fluvio, etc. Trying different colors, of course, but the whole urban field is kind of following that, and maybe with more ordinary topologies at the moment, but there's a kind of charge field set up artificially because there's nothing else there except for the track, and there was this kind of morphology of straight lines and curling in, which was kind of taken up, and the relationship with the grandstand here of that hotel structure is kind of a floating beam with these kind of cockpit-like special lounges, quite nice. I think I have to move on, and then we have this kind of again. So the idea of swarms and fields, and these are point grids. So there's also an economy and a minimalism which I'm promoting, that you set up the parameters should be as strong and minimal as possible. You just have a series of variables which create that field, make that swarm work. And there's, randomness and there's order. This was one of the Innsbruck projects, and it took up these kind of tower fields, and then looked at this kind of genotype-phenotype relationship with the skinny one. The thicker one could have a secondary voids around the core, or the core kind of at a certain extent, when it becomes a slab, kind of has this mitosis going, and it sets up two cores. Then there is a facade related to this, a structure, and this is, and that structure is just a mesh stretched across. This distortion has to do with the urban work of focusing in with the overall profile of the flock. So it's initially just a disturbance, but later on it becomes a kind of, it's utilized as a kind of terraced sky lobby in there. So there's a different conditions. So here you can see that this kind of disturbance, which does urban work with respect to the overall, is then also an occasion to invent something new, and which amplifies this condition. And again, so there is an attempt to kind of build up these genotypes, multiple components, subsystems, and my dream is always to say this becomes one kind of automized to the extent that you create a generative component or something similar and let this iterate across the field, and you prescribe the variables of adaptation and also the thresholds where a core splinters. An interesting subtle relationships. This is the office part and the residential part in terms of the relationship of which part is cut, which part is closed in the core, and then don't be afraid of a bit of agglomeration. And I realized that in Beijing, one of the most beautiful projects are those which give you the certain calmness and order of 20, 40 towers in one wind cast. I prefer that rather than kind of random cacophony of disorienting stuff. So it's also a beautiful flow diagram of a single direction in a one-way system flowing through. Picked up on these kind of dip crater idea from us from the New York project, and this is Thomas Mattoy at Innsbruck, and we did this, in Vienna we did fields of towers from things which are unexplained to things which are also unexplained, and in between there's not, there's, let's say, a tower proportion, but and this is an interesting one because it's also multifunctional, because it has three, it has a rectilinear, a T square, and an H plan. Iterates, morphs between, and then the interesting part is a deep facade, or where this kind of honeycomb pattern from a closed condition of retail becomes this kind of office, becomes a kind of balcony condition. I quite like this, very subtle, very economic, and convincing in terms of the modulation, iteration, in terms of residential, office, and retail typologies. Or this idea again of interfacing and finding ways of this was worked on the facade and making the facade deep and generating the volume inside from the facade and then working all back into the urban. Istanbul projects from Vienna, and we're coming to one of our kind of major projects, which I'm still kind of baffled that we presented this kind of Maya model and just modeled by Daniel Wiedrich, who and Safed and others worked on the project, and Deva. We used hair dynamic, which came fresh from DRL, with kind of hair dynamic tools to stitch across the fabric here, and perhaps string on skylines, perhaps interfaces with the grid, but have this kind of stitching across with these splintering, bundling lines. Attempts to draw typologies into these. Later Rhino models. There are different conditions. It's a marina city. It's urban projects and towers on the crossing or blocks in between the crossing lines, but also a lot of fabric studies. And again, this idea of how far can you stretch a morphology, and it is always has a certain character. It's always this kind of split block, which becomes an atrium, the higher one, and also this kind of extreme stretch of scale, just as a hypothesis, and then see what could come out of it, or the interlocking between block and tower, pulling the corners up. These are quite extreme. Then introducing that gap, which might be pedestrian path systems. And you get character, you get kind of something which is the same in all its iterations, and then this idea of Zaha came in and wanted calligraphy and pulling across the blocks with these kind of elements, and I think it works very well. And this one, I'm always amazed by this little animation, the way you can kind of take something generic and fit it, make it fit, and create the kind of conspicuous discontinuities within it, but smoothly integrated back into the fabric, into the grain, and some exuberance at the edges, perhaps. And I think I'm nearly there, but I just wanted to show also one of the DR projects working with these kind of systems. Jose and his team, K-matics, soft bodies in force fields, hard bodies first, force bodies, and developing a kind of repertoire. I mean, these are very self-evident tools which are available, and we've worked with them, and developing a kind of array of volumes and fabrics, and then kind of stringing in a circulatory system, which is interesting, and also generated a new typology of kind of splintering roads, having a second swarm cutting out, scooping out. I mean, DRL people know this, but let's say for the benefit of the office to see that as well. And the scooping swarm becomes all the retail areas, binding together blocks, and also dipping and dishing in, and creating these kind of coherent spaces for retail. Oh, this was this nice idea of the splintering road, navigating these pieces. Then again, trying to develop the thick facade, the subsystems, the typologies on different scales, and deciding then on the facade what might be a distribution of residential and office or retail, the kind of solid, perhaps a bit randomized here, but I think there's always this kind of dialectic between the random and orders, because arbitrary steps are taken, and then you kind of start knitting and folding and interarticulating. In an attempt to kind of work this through, and again always even on the facade again does urban work. So the architecture in its articulatory steps kind of is always reflected back to the urban issues which are at stake, like the ground formations and some of the interiors. One last point, perhaps, which has always been interested in is this idea of the perception of complexity, and that a lot of these topics are about making these complex relationships and the density of relationships of elements to wholes, part to wholes relationships evident and felt and navigable. but also looking back at Gestalt grouping principles. When you have all these fragments, you start seeing kind of clusters, you start seeing centers, you start seeing lines and ligaments and so on, even if it's just a kind of, in reality, not continuously built structures. I mean, don't believe in these kind of mega structures, but I'm believing in kind of, the kind of coordination of elements which are separate, and you will tie in vertical lines or horizontal lines here. You follow lines of continuity. You even symmetry is interesting because it pulls things together. It draws things together within certain perspectives. So, and again, this is the way you can constitute entities and moments, and you compose in a sense these kind of secondary, indirectly existing structures, and the elements themselves are lost fragments if they're not bound into these continuities. We'll jump over this, but it's interesting also in terms of looking at parametric models and parametric setup, which are in this sense sensitive Gestalt readings, and and looking directly at observer parameters like observer position and scene parameters. So, for instance, the way with the heights here is obviously something which is totally disjoint and fragmented, but pulls together from a certain perspective. Something very straightforward, where you can utilize this. And interested in setting up parametric models which are highly Gestalt sensitive, where small shift in certain parameters, object parameters, scene parameters like lighting, and ambient parameters, or observer parameters, just as camera position, would trigger these reconfigurations, because there's the attempt here is to say they have a multiplicity of agendas and competing, perhaps even audiences, and trying to find identity and place. And you want to find too many places, so you come up with this kind of idea of multiple iconicity. And we started this also in Vienna with this, where you have these crazy schemes, which are these blatant icons, which are single-minded but unperceived. They're never perceived. And there's this kind of project here, for instance, which tries to set up a kind of cluster of towers, which becomes its interesting icon. And there's a kind of parametric setup where this kind of tower has a number of kind of twisting points and can pick up configurations like these, and then to look at this system from different views, and you create a kind of top-heavy field from one direction, or bottom-heavy field from another direction, kind of center-heavy field, or something in between and random, and from some oblique views. So there's an attempt to set the cameras and manipulate the figure, and then check back how it appears from different sides, and that it becomes conspicuous and has identity from each different side. Very simple idea. And you set up these long, approach trajectories to make this work. So from a different perspective, it will be a different flock, a different object, as it were, and that's the different distant views. Which are set up, and then there is a next level of detail, which comes about splintering and splitting this, and twisting this. So these are kind of mutually amplifying moves, where the twist kind of emphasizes or the split rather emphasizes the twist and makes it legible. There's an attempt to have a kind of internal. Once you approach from within, you have an internal kind of placemaking and points of radiation rippling through, which are kind of articulated as these kind of notches or pockets pulling through, etc. So there's an attempt to incorporate parametric urbanism with a strong emphasis on, let's say, legibility and multiple readings, the kind of phonological appearance of these clusters, and set it up on this way. And there's a second one which works with moire and then details that moire with these kind of scooped, curling profiles, then slices it up, and it will come out what this might mean. You have then kind of hidden continuities, and this view is all lost, and you get kind of, and these are these scoops, and you get kind of icon figures out of this, quite curiously. This is not just isolating these, but there's this kind of scatter of fields, and you have these kind of streams of space coming through, the attempt to have the kind of dialectic of object or figure crystallization out of the field depending on observer position and depending on certain other amplification mechanisms like lighting, etc. I think that's it.
Just noticed, I don't know if you're working on that, but folder called autopoiesis on your desktop. Are you working on autopoiesis as a new method of developing architecture?
Actually, with this concept, I have been banded around, and I've been using that. I've written an article called "The Autopoiesis of Architecture," but I'm using this concept more on another order of reflection. I cannot directly and would not directly address projects on this level. It was actually in connection with the responsive environments. Where we tried to, in the last iteration of the DRL, work with responsive mechanisms, where we had to think about how these mechanisms, in a sense, conceive the world, and you have kind of system-environment relationships, and this whole discourse of worldviews generated by these responsive systems. It's an interesting discourse. Sadly, you picked it up because it's not straight to the topic. So,
thanks, Patrick. This was really excellent and difficult to remember. Like Bill Gates told us, we only need 64K of memory. I only remember the first two things you said: seamlessness and across all scales. Seamlessness is obviously a difficult topic when it touches on the material, because obviously in architecture the way we understand jointing is not necessarily seamless, and when it comes to the proliferation of components, it becomes actually an ever more complex question of the seam. I was wondering whether you could say something about that, and then maybe one question regarding the parametric and why the main preference in the project that you show are mainly one system top-down parametrics, maybe a kind of multi-directional field, but one, not many, or something that operates top-down and then articulates all the directionalities all the way down to the component. And lastly, whether there is anything of performance beyond the merely visual, which would then probably require that different systems at different scales are informed by different concerns.
Okay. I hope I can follow more than the first two parts of the question. First of all, I think the emphasis on, let's say, the visual result and impact should not be misunderstood as something about a superficial sense of just look or awe or thrill about how things look. But the attempt is really I'm arguing for that the sense of aesthetic that the aesthetic category of coherency and integration, which we are guided by when we kind of navigate the world, makes sense because these coherencies have underlying logics, even if they're not always explicit. I believe that they can be followed and they can be kind of learned and could be guided by. So there's something about orientation as a key category and comprehension. And I think that it always works together also with mental maps. So we also have to learn to a certain extent new mental maps and new categories, new sensibilities and appreciations. But it's all in the service of orienting, navigating this world and be at home in that more complex world. And that's why I think I'm interested in order and complex order, I always verify that through the visual appreciation. I'm not so interested in, as an architect, in sense that where you build up an objectively operating order, where we have to believe that something is efficient or well structured, like kind of traffic flows, but it is not transparent. I cannot perceive that. It is kind of something you have to believe or is there. That's not the domain of architecture. I would put this kind of level of functional organization into the domain of the engineer ultimately. As a starting point, I think it's in the domain of architecture, because engineering are competing for this. Let's say if you look at something like space syntax, or you look at traffic management systems, there's a indirect competition with how to order and arrange, and you get directly criticized in projects on this level. And I think this is something we should be intelligent about, but ultimately I believe that reflection on the subject, and perhaps even social and collectively constructed subjects through mental maps and systems of comprehension is where you have to locate the architectural expertise in terms of articulating this complexity. And it's a bit like I was saying, and I'm saying this is on the one, to some extent there are some natural kind of biases and abilities, of course, as cognitive beings, which makes it possible to talk about something like, Gestalt grouping principles, and you have certain effects. And we looked at the psychology of perception, certain, bottom-up effects which you can generate in everybody. But a lot of this is also, let's say, top-down and learned. I mean, how we learn to kind of watch a soap opera or very rapidly cut commercials. So we have to also learn to new kind of architectural tropes and so on, and ways of navigating complex urban fields. And with along, my main topic has often been argue for vectors of transformation and gradients. It's not only my topic, it's a lot of been banded around, instead of saying I'm only orienting with respect to iconic objects or bounded domains or nested domains within domains, which is the usual way. Where are you? We're in that room, which is in that building, which is in that district, etc. And that's where, and when you navigate by remembering which boundaries you crossed. That's different in a kind of field of drifting forces and iterations and where you don't remember a particular object, you don't remember a particular address. And that's some of those projects, and urban projects are like that. In particular, if you don't know your territory, you navigate field qualities. But again, I'm only interested in that. Do I see it or don't I see it? If I don't see it, I'm not interested in that supposed order. That's why I would privilege this. And recently I've been trying to, the last part was very under-articulated and was rushed. This topic of looking at this more carefully and closely in terms of experimenting parametric setups, which are what I call Gestalt sensitive, where you certain parameters change and things become more conspicuous or less conspicuous, or something. And it's a figure ground separation, kind of bring things to the foreground, push things to the background, and use that either within an economy, that it could work on an urban, through ambient parameters or observer parameters, etc. That's, I feel, is very, very strong. I'm interested in. But one last point, perhaps, to pick up, that leads a lot to bottom, let's say, to top down, because I'm interested in the final arrangements and always testing the result. But I do know that a lot of people are interested in. DRL has been working with bottom-up processes, which are more kind of proliferating, and often these scripts which are just iterative and agglomerative, and end up often with you have to build in a lot of random, often end up with more kind of amorphous structures which have measurable parameters, because you've built them in from the beginning. There was always going to be this kind of whether fractal logic. There's always going to be, and I'm just trying to find get a grips. I mean, I'm sure it can be done, that you can you can build in that loop of the perceptive control, whether these orders are visible and legible in the end or not. That is, I think, for me, a key criterion.
My point really kind of starts from the question of the seam and the seamless. Because obviously, traditionally, in the very definition really of a kind of architectural object, the seam, I mean, as Michael indicated, not only kind of is a kind of arena of like making a joint, but it's also the sort of the way in which the building draws itself or draws attention to the elements that make up something like its form and the way its form relates to the fact that it is an object. Now, by kind of stressing the kind of seamless, it seems to me what very interestingly kind of occurs is that in a sense the buildings aren't initially kind of objects as such, or let's call them kind of post-objects, in something like the following sense. In order to have any notion of their kind of objecthood, they have to be experienced as a series, and therefore as a kind of set of kind of differences. Now, I think what's extremely interesting about that is that at the level of some presumed experience of the situation, you're not it's not like seeing a building where in the last instance the definition of its form, the guarantee of its objecthood as such, comes from the fact that there is a kind of relation between the spectator and the object, which the object is supposed to guarantee, which even if we describe that as a subjective visual experience, is actually dominated by the objectivity of the object. Whereas here, in a sense, what I think it opens up in a kind of, in a way which is quite difficult to articulate, is that the experience of the object now as a set of differences between a series is intrinsically subjective. That is to say, it's not kind of governed by traditional definitions of an object. And therefore, it kind of moves into this regime. You talk at the end about the forms of sort of subjective kind of recognition. I mean, on the one hand, in terms of traditional questions of recognition and orientation, something like the subject position in a perspectival drawing, that's achieved no longer, as it were, through something like perspective or the experience of it in relation to the object. It's achieved simply by the act of recognition. It's as if you recognize it by the fact that now you recognize it, and it's not, everything else is relative to that sort of anamorphotic. I mean, in general, it does seem to me to kind of raise an incredibly interesting level that far, as other people would say, this was a kind of upping of the stakes of objecthood. It seems to me actually a kind of incredibly impressive entry to a kind of system of subjectivity.
It's interesting. The topic has been fascinating for many years, for a long time. And one thing I realized is that in architecture, you don't have objects. Because the object means I can pull it away. It's loose of its context. It can be dropped here and there. You can never do this with architecture. A car is still an object because it moves from one place to another and has an integral. It's always clear what is the system and what is in the environment, because the environment changes and the system stays the same. With architecture, it's not like this. You don't move buildings around, so there isn't that sense. And with architecture, what is interesting me is also like a mountain. I mean, we're looking for objects, but mountains are never entities you could kind of delimit. This is in a certain profile, a certain view. It could be a name given to it. From the other side, it is most of it isn't. And buildings could be like this. And I think what has been clear, of course, in the history of let's say cognitive psychology interfacing with the arts, and is something like this here, which is then experimented in the still life. The still life is usually, it should be these kind of arrangements which should be the most evident and self-evident and unquestioned. Like philosophers love to talk about chairs because they seem to be so wonderfully clean and they should be so unambiguous. And so when it comes to still lifes as a kind of object of dissection, I like this a lot, because what here is very unclear, because an object is rarely just crystallizes it gathers a number of parts, and there's a kind of moment of synthesis. But these parts, what is a part and what is a whole, is very unclear. And in architecture, it could be like this, and that is fascinating. And this is just to go through this very quickly. This is actually a purist painting by Le Corbusier, and working in the domain of the Cubists were interesting to cut and dissect and scatter the object back into the background, have object background separation kind of questioned and made difficult. And here the kind of synthetic cubism are trying to assemble arrangements which are where what constitutes a whole and what constitutes the part is continuously changing. This guitar isn't there because this is just a kind of another armchair pulled against this table. This is just the top of a pile of plates. These things are just tops of bottles and pipes and glasses. So there's something kind of disappearing. And there's a game of affiliation, and this is continuously interesting about the bottle and the kind of body of the book, and this part of the book and this top of the glass creating another bottle. These games are very interesting. And in architecture you could have that, because you cannot take a piece and shift it away. So you can set up these multiple and it's in a city. It's always what is a square, what is a center, what is a road. All of this is always already ambiguous, but it could be interestingly amplified, and that is that moment where I would like to have this kind of arrangement as a kind of super gestalt sensitive latent condition turned into parametric model, teased out by a number of parameters which are small object manipulations, which would kind of which could break out one reading and destroy another, and have this kind of oscillation, and then specifically play and work with observer parameters to tease that out. So I'm thinking in architecture, this objecthood is interestingly precarious always already. And I can observe that. You even go back in history with beautiful analysis of complexity and contradiction of Venturi, and the idea of the difficult whole, and analyzing the Baroque versus the Renaissance, and certain moves you can make in terms of inflecting things together to forge these quasi-objects. And the interest is in this latency, and it's also in the intensification of relatedness of each quasi-object. An object you always name within certain constellations, which are constellations ultimately of social constellations, because you gather a certain populace for a certain event. You kind of gather also spatial fragments into a whole for this event and this event only. And that is the kind of vision. That's my point on this, and that's why I'm remaining interested in let's say what you might call the visual, but it's more than it's the cognition of complexity. I think. Shall we stop it here?
Yeah. Perfect. Thanks very much.